Hey there guys, how are you today and welcome to my review of the 2018 Chinese Grand Prix. Wow, what a race that was. We thought the Bahrain Grand Prix was pretty good, and it was. But in my opinion, this Grand Prix, the Chinese Grand Prix, beats it. So let's talk about the story of the race. So Sebastian Vettel, of course one of the leading drivers in the World Championship race for this season, got away from pole position pretty well, but Bottas was able to overtake his teammate Kimi Raikkonen at turn 1. He was then able to undercut Vettel in the pit stops and was on course for a fairly unexpected victory. However, a crash between the two Toro Rosso drivers, Pierre Gasly and Brendan Hartley, turned the race on its head. The safety car came out and Bottas and Vettel were unable to change their tyres at this point because they'd already passed the pit lane. However, the Red Bull drivers, Daniel Ricciardo and Max Verstappen, and many of the midfield runners were able to change their tyres and had fresher tyres at the end of the race. Ricciardo and Verstappen came storming through the upper end of the grid, and Daniel Ricciardo took a fantastic victory this weekend. Verstappen could have easily made it a Red Bull 1-2, maybe he could have won the race himself, we'll never know, but a collision when attempting to overtake Sebastian Vettel left him with a penalty at the end of the race, and ultimately only P5. Now it is time to talk about all the drivers so I can review them and give you more of my opinions about this week's Grand Prix. And I think there's only one place to start. Daniel Ricciardo, the race winner. The weekend started pretty badly for the smiling Australian driver with an engine failure in free practice 3, and of course that led to more discussions that we're having in this past race, post Bahrain, about whether he needs to be in a more reliable car if he wants to be able to compete for the World Championship this season or in a future season. But his team did brilliantly to fix the engine just in time for qualifying. He scraped through Q1 by the skin of his teeth, and he started in P6. He was having a fairly peaceful race until the safety car came out. He was able to dive into the pit lane, and he fought his way through the field with great overtakes on drivers such as Hamilton, Vettel, and probably my favourite overtake of all, his one on Bottas, and he was able to win the race through a Shuri, etc, etc. What a fantastic race for the really smiling Australian. He'll be delighted with that. It really makes the season a bit more exciting. Can Red Bull fight for the championship this year? I think it's going to be interesting. They clearly have a fast car. Ricciardo and Verstappen were certainly battling with Mercedes and Ferrari before the safety car came out, so I don't see why they can't be in the fight. And I think it is what we all want to see. We've finally had a really good battle between the top 3 teams, and ultimately it is Daniel Ricciardo who came out on top. Next up is Mercedes driver Valtteri Bottas, and ultimately the Finnish driver has had a pretty disappointing week. Of course, there's lots of criticism of him post Bahrain with his sort of half-hearted attempt to overtake Vettel in that race. But I would say with P2 in this race, he made up for it quite a bit, although he did say he was actually disappointed with the result overall. So he made a great start to get ahead of Kimi Raikkonen at turn 1, and then had a good outlap to be able to overtake Vettel during the pit stops. However, both Bottas and Vettel had passed the safety car line when the safety car came out, and it meant they couldn't put on a fresh set of tyres to use once the safety car period had finished. This allowed the cars behind to overtake in the last 10 laps. Bottas did out-qualify and out-race his teammate Lewis Hamilton, which has to be a positive, and I guess his 2 close second places in 2018 suggests he's very much on the pace, but ultimately he was pretty unlucky not to win this race, in my opinion. He did overtake Raikkonen as well during the race when Raikkonen was trying to hold him up to allow Vettel to re-overtake. Bottas made a brilliant move around the outside of turn 1, and he was unlucky, and he has so said he is disappointed, but he will also be optimistic for future races such as the next one in Azerbaijan. Completing the podium was Ferrari's driver Kimi Raikkonen, and if I'm honest, in the race Ferrari had kind of screwed over Kimi Raikkonen yet again by leaving him out so long in the first stint, and he fell back down to P6. However, he did have, thankfully for him, he still had fairly fresh tyres when the safety car came out. He wasn't able to overtake Bottas despite trying at the end of the race, but did well to finish P3 and hold off a charging and probably pretty angry Max Verstappen. Also, as for Kimi Raikkonen, he was so close to getting pole position. Vettel got it by less than a tenth of a second. And had he been on pole position, the race could have been completely different. And he was certainly again in the fight for victory this weekend. So ultimately, it was a pretty good weekend for the Finnish driver. In P4, we have the reigning world champion Lewis Hamilton, who is normally an expert at this circuit. And ultimately, Lewis Hamilton described the Grand Prix weekend as a disaster weekend in his post-race interview. On Friday, in practice, he was one of the fastest, but by the end of Q3, him and his Mercedes teammate Valtteri Bottas were half a second behind Ferrari in qualifying, and Hamilton was never really in contention to win the race on race day, unlike his teammate Valtteri Bottas. He did have a good battle with Verstappen, but we have to question why Mercedes didn't pit him when the safety car came out. Mercedes said they didn't have enough tyres left, so maybe they need to reconsider their tyre strategy for the whole weekend. But I think Hamilton's lack of pace and generally Mercedes' fall from the very top, particularly in qualifying, is one of the biggest stories coming out of the weekend. They have dominated the sport now since 2014, but this is the first time we've had 3 races in a row in hybrid era where Mercedes haven't won. Tell me in the comments if you know where the last streak of non-Mercedes victories was. Tell me if you know. But I think this is a pretty big talking point. Are Mercedes still the fastest team in F1? Or have they been beaten to it by Ferrari? And are Red Bull faster than them? It's going to be something to really look out for. And in general, it was a pretty poor weekend, especially by his standards, for Lewis Hamilton. Max Verstappen finished on track in P4, but a 10-second penalty following a collision with Sebastian Vettel meant he only has been classified in P5. Verstappen was in prime position to win the race as the leading driver on fresh tyres. He was ahead of Ricciardo at that point after the safety car, but he nearly had a crash with Lewis Hamilton and did have one with Sebastian Vettel at the hairpin. He has admitted it was his fault, which is a change for Max Verstappen, but he still got a 10-second penalty, which meant Hamilton was able to retake his position. But it did, in reality, only mean a lot of one place for Verstappen, while Vettel was left a lot worse. His aggressive driving style did mean that Verstappen did have a great start, gaining 2 places. But we do have to take a look at what happened at the end of his crash with Vettel. It was just a too ambitious move at the hairpin. He basically rammed into the side of Sebastian Vettel. Does he need to change? Tell me in the comments. I think we all like Verstappen's aggressive driving style. It always means there's always a potential for an exciting race, or at least an exciting overtake. He can really lighten up a boring race. But does he need to change? Can he win a world championship without changing? That's the biggest talking point, I think, at the moment. Tell me in the comments down below. Best of the rest this weekend was undoubtedly Renault driver German Nico Hülkenberg. Now, I'm not going to start praising him for beating Vettel, because that was just because of Vettel's instant and the damage. But in general, Hülkenberg didn't fall too far behind the faster cars throughout the race, and was maybe, just maybe, in contention for a podium following the safety car. It wasn't beyond the realms of possibility. He was able to, he beat his teammate yet again, and ultimately in a pretty competitive midfield, he was the fastest. So that must be a pretty strong weekend for Nico Hülkenberg and the team. Helped the team in their fight to get a P4 in the constructors. All round, a pretty positive weekend for the German driver. Next up is McLaren's leading driver, Fernando Alonso. Again, Alonso and his teammate failed to get out of Q2, failed to get into Q3. But again, another points finish for the Spanish driver. 3 in a row, and in a very tight midfield. It's very impressive, especially it seems like in qualifying, McLaren seemed to be struggling quite a bit. But ultimately, the race is the most important. That's where the points are won. And Alonso, for now at least, seems consistently to be getting those points. We've been happy to score those points to help the team in the constructors and help him in the Drivers' World Championship. And ultimately, he beat his arch rival Sebastian Vettel. I think maybe his aggressive overtake on Sebastian Vettel was a little bit too aggressive at turn one. He squeezed him out a bit too much, in my opinion. Vettel did complain on the radio, but there weren't any penalties or anything applied. I don't think they went to the steward's office or anything like that. But yeah, Fernando Alonso will be pretty smug after this weekend and we're hoping for better in future races. Ultimately, Sebastian Vettel had a disappointing weekend and only came home in P8. He did take a pretty stunning pole position. It was a superb lap in Q3 right at the end of the session to take pole position away from his teammate by the smallest of margins, less than a tenth of a second. He made a great start but got jumped by Bottas in the pits, following a fairly poor Ferrari strategy which left him out a little bit too long. He did certainly try to challenge Bottas for the lead and was probably going to continue to do that until the end of the race. However, after the safety car, which of course Vettel lost out in because he had gone past the pit lane when it came out, he got crashed into by Max Verstappen. This caused him to spin, of course, making him lose a few places. And then Alonso was also able to overtake him as he was able to catch him up due to the damage that Vettel had, and Carlos Sainz nearly got past in the final lap as well. So you know what, P8 in terms of the championship is pretty bad because assuming his main rival is Lewis Hamilton, which I think it still is, Hamilton, despite having also a poor weekend, got more points than him, gained him, and now the gap has been cut from 17 to only 9 points. So it's been a slightly mixed weekend for Vettel, I guess. Qualifying was good, and he didn't personally put a foot wrong in the race. He was unlucky with the timing of the safety car, and of course Max Verstappen crashing into him was a bit of a pain, but he did do his best all weekend, and he'd be hoping for better luck next time out at the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. Carlos Sainz came home in P9 in what was certainly an improved weekend for the young Spanish driver. He was still behind his teammate all weekend, but they did go wheel to wheel a bit on lap 1, and I guess Sainz is still getting accustomed to his new team and the car. But I would say this weekend was an improvement, and I don't think it'll be long till we see him racing equally with Nico Hulkenberg. He also nearly overtook Sebastian Vettel at the end. Maybe he could have been a bit more aggressive there. Maybe, look into his inner Max Verstappen. But he could have got P8, but he'll be pretty happy with P9 in what was a fairly strong weekend for Carlos Sainz, and all round a pretty brilliant weekend for the Renault team. Rounding off the top 10 was the Haas driver Kevin Magnussen, and I would say he'll also be pretty happy with this weekend. Okay, he was unlucky with the safety car timing, but he did at least get into Q3. He also has said in interviews that he's pretty happy with the car, and he is pretty excited for the rest of the season. So all round a strong weekend for Magnussen, getting another point on the board, and ultimately it looks like Haas are going to be able to consolidate their place that they have in the 2018 season. Of course, there's still question marks over whether they're copying Ferrari's design, but fewer people are talking about that now, which is, I suppose, good for them. And yeah, Magnussen will be pretty happy. He did have to ask his team to get his teammate Roman Grosjean out of the way, so it's a shame we couldn't overtake him normally. But it was, and that's the second race in a row where that's happened to happen, I believe. So it could have been better, and he was unlucky with the safety car timing, but overall a strong weekend for Kevin Magnussen. Just outside the top 10, we had the Force India pair of Esteban Ocon and Sergio Perez. As a team, they had some more pace this weekend in comparison to the first two races of the 2018 season, and were certainly close to scoring some more points. They did get in each other's way at the start of the Grand Prix, which meant Ocon lost some time, and maybe you could say that cost Ocon a point or two, because he would have been a few seconds up the road. But I don't know, I think it's crazy to think like that in F1, because there's so many factors that affect where a driver finishes. I think that's maybe a bit of a silly point in hindsight, but they were a bit more on the pace. Both drivers had a fairly strong race. They didn't crash they had a little incident at the start, but they didn't crash into each other. They didn't take each other out like they did on a few occasions in 2017. And I guess we are now coming towards the European part of the season, which is where there'll be upgrades, and Force India really do need those upgrades to come if they're going to get beyond only having 1 point in the 2018 season. In P13, we had the young McLaren driver, Stoffel van Dorn, and it was ultimately a pretty unlucky weekend for the young driver. He didn't really have too much pace to show in the race. I'm not too sure how the safety car impacted on him, but probably the biggest moment of his weekend was in practice, where the team had a dodgy pit stop and the wheel came off, which meant the team got fined. And this is another example of bad pit stops in 2018. Of course, we had Haas going wrong in Australia, Ferrari having an issue in Bahrain, and now McLaren in China. But thankfully for McLaren, it happened in practice rather than during the race. So that's something for Van Dorn to be happy about. But again, we have to question what is going on with pit stops this season. I suppose it's not a Van Dorn specific issue, but it happened to Van Dorn this weekend. And it's an interesting thing what teams can do now in future races to try to improve their pit stops in terms of safety for the rest of the season. And in general, the issues of pit stop safety isn't going away anytime soon. In P14 and 15, we had the Williams pairing of Lance Stroll and Sergei Sirotkin, and this was ultimately another poor weekend for the British team. Neither driver got out of Q1, although Sirotkin did out-qualify his teammate Lance Stroll, which I guess he'd be pretty happy with. Stroll made the better start. He actually made a pretty good start and was pretty close to the point scoring positions, but he fell back later on in the race. His teammate Russian Sergei Sirotkin seemed to have a fairly quiet race. We didn't see much of him during the Grand Prix. He was ultimately beaten by Lance Stroll on race day. I think change is needed at Williams. Lots of pressure on Paddy Lowe to see what he can do to help the team, and a lot of change if they're gonna rescue their season. I'm gonna have to keep saying this while they're still on 0 points, because they're the only team on no points after 3 races. They're constantly being knocked out of Q1, which is pretty poor by their standards. This used to be a World Championship winning team. In 2014 they were fighting for victories. In 2015 at Silverstone they fought for victory. It didn't go so well, but they were in the fight for the victory at Silverstone 2015. Now only a few years later, they seem to be the backmarkers in Formula 1. Pretty bad and disappointing. Change is needed, a lot of it. The star of the Bahrain Grand Prix, Marcus Ericsson, finished the Chinese Grand Prix in P16, while his teammate had a difficult race, only finishing in P19, being the last of the finishers. Ericsson had a fairly quiet race. We didn't see too much of him during the race, which in some ways is a good thing, I guess. And he had a bit of a poor first lap. He lost a few places and never really recovered from that. He did have a decent pace on the medium tyre towards the end of the race, but he was certainly never in contention to repeat his fantastic Bahrain result. While his teammate Charles Leclerc is still customizing to Formula 1, he had a spin during the race, as you can see on the image on the screen, and he was the last of the finishers. And I guess it's soon going to get to the point, how long do we give him to acclimatise to Formula 1? We know he is a great racing driver, as we saw during his time in Formula 2 last season, particularly in Bahrain. But what can he do? Can he acclimatise to Formula 1 quick enough? He is meant to be a future Ferrari world champion, but is that going to really happen? And I reckon the next few races are going to be really crucial for the longevity of his Formula 1 career. Roman Grosjean finished the Chinese Grand Prix in P17, and it was ultimately a disappointing but also unlucky weekend for the young French driver. I believe he had some braking issues during qualifying, with the brakes overheating, but hopefully we're not going to have a repeat of last season where he always seemed to have brake issues. And during the race he just seemed to be a bit slower than his teammate Kevin Magnussen. Pretty much that was what was the end of his race. Pretty much he was unhappy being asked to let through his teammate Kevin Magnussen towards the start of the race, as Magnussen was simply the faster driver at the start of the race. They were on different strategies as well, and I suppose ultimately Roman Grosjean never really recovered in the rest of the race. He was unlucky during the safety car, and that maybe pushed him down a little bit with the timing of the safety car, but he never really recovered and only finished in P17, which could hurt the Haas team come towards the end of the season. They want to fight for P4. It's going to be tight. Roman Grosjean can't afford to have another poor weekend like he has had in China. Finally, it is time to talk about the Toro Rosso pairing of Pierre Gasly, who of course was the star of the race in Bahrain, and Brendan Hartley. Ultimately, these are the drivers that caused the race to turn on its head. Essentially, Hartley was meant to be letting Gasly through, as Gasly was the faster driver, and he was going to do it at the hairpin, but obviously some miscommunication maybe to blame. But Gasly essentially ran into uh, his teammate Brendan Hartley, which caused a safety car. The actual crash kind of looked identical to the Vettel and Verstappen one, although obviously this took place before the Vettel and Verstappen crash. Hartley eventually retired, I believe, from the damage from the crash. I'm not 100% sure. Gasly, though, did apologise at the end of the race, which was a nice touch. Unlike some drivers, he was prepared to admit it was his fault. And yeah, but clearly the team were unable to repeat the pace they had in Bahrain, which is ultimately the main headline in terms of Toro Rosso from this weekend. So yeah, I've talked about all the teams and drivers. Tell me in the comments what you thought of the Chinese Grand Prix. And I guess the most exciting thing is that the next race in a couple of weeks is the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, which last year was certainly the most exciting race of the 2017 F1 season.